Hello, this video is on the date of Christ's birth. Let me share my screen. Okay, this is a picture of the Church of the Nativity on the left. That part of the picture there in Bethlehem, that's celebrating this place where Jesus was born. Now, this is part of a series of videos on dating the books in the New Testament. And the date of Christ's birth really isn't a major factor in dating the books of the New Testament. But if you want to have a chronology of the New Testament events and timeline overall, it's still helpful to get a little bit of a handle on it. So my suggestion to give you the conclusion right up front is that Christ was born in the year 2 BC. We probably need to talk about terminology. The BC means before Christ, and AD is Anno Domini, which is Latin for year of our Lord. More commonly today, people use BCE for before Common Era. That means same as BC, and CE for Common Era. That's same as AD, as a concession to the majority of the world, which has the same calendar that we have, but they're not Christians. I've been using BC and AD in my videos and books so far. So if we divide time between BC and AD, does that mean that Jesus was born on the year 0? Well, the answer is no. First of all, we should explain the 0 problem when we're dealing with dates and numbers in general, and that's that 0 was not a number used in antiquity, at least not in the Near East, in the Middle East at the time of Christ, in the Bible time, or even in the early church era. We didn't use a number 0. And this causes a lot of problems for us because we're so used to it, it's almost impossible to even think without thinking 0-based stuff. And like, for really common one is that Jesus rose from the dead on the third day, which was Sunday, with the crucifixion being on Friday. Now, we would probably number that as 2 days, but they counted as 3. Similarly, there's a Hebrew idiom that's used a number of times in the Old Testament that really means previously, but literally it reads yesterday or 3 days ago, with the day before yesterday being 3 days ago. We would count the day before yesterday as being 2 days ago, but they just didn't count that way. And this affects the chronologies of kings. When you're trying to compare chronologies, it gets complicated because on the one hand, they didn't count the same way we do. On the other hand, they still have to make math work. It didn't mean that they got all their math problems wrong. And so sure enough, when we try to put together a chronology of the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel, it was apparent that one of those kingdoms was counting differently, from some were beginning on the first with 1, and some really didn't start with 1 until after the king had had a full year in. So anyway, the early Christian calendar calculations put Jesus' birth in 1 AD. So not 0, because there was no 0. But even those calculations were actually a little bit off. They didn't have quite the information that we have today, and they didn't actually calculate it quite right. In Luke chapter 3, we have some information that we can use as a bit of a timetable. This is a bust of Tiberius Caesar. He became Caesar in 14 AD. And Luke, who pays more attention to chronology and order than the other gospel writers, was pretty detailed about people and dates. He said in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judah, and so on. And this is the beginning. This verse is Luke 3:1, and it's really talking about when John the Baptist starts his ministry. And so Jesus comes in just a little after John the Baptist. So the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius would be in 28 or 29. Once again, I'm not sure whether it's 28 or 29 because I'm not sure how they were counting, whether they were counting 1 or sort of starting from a 0, sort of. So anyway, Jesus, when he began his ministry, was about 30 years of age, is what Luke says later in the chapter. So if you subtract 30 years from 28 or 29, you go back to 3 or 2 BC for the birth of Jesus. So here's something from Wikipedia. If you quote a source from Wikipedia, you probably need to mark down, like I did there, when you retrieved the date, because Wikipedia will change from time to time. But at the moment, it says the date of birth for Jesus of Nazareth is not stated in the Gospels or any secular text, but a majority of scholars assume a date between 6 BC and 4 BC. Now, when Wikipedia says a majority of scholars assumes that date, they're really correct. That is the date that the majority of scholars assume. So why do they back up as far as that? You know, they backed up farther than I did. Well, there's a reason. It's because of Herod the Great. You see, Jesus was born, it was when Herod the Great was king. That's what Luke 1:5 says. That's really the Annunciation to John the Baptist. Matthew is even more specific. It says, now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king. And it goes on to tell the story about Herod and the wise men. Now, this might be a bust of Herod, or it might be a bust of somebody else. They're not for sure. But he reigned from about 37, 36 BC to 4 BC or 1 BC. You see, there's a little bit of disagreement about the date of his death. When did Herod die? That's the key question, because Jesus was born before Herod died. And the majority view has the death of Herod in 4 BC. That picture I showed you before said 4 or 1, but the majority view says 4. The minority view says 1. How would we know? You know, there's not enough information in the Bible or most other ancient texts to say, except for there is one. And that's Josephus. Flavius Josephus wrote a book called Antiquities of the Jews. He also wrote quite a few other things. He was a prolific writer, and he wrote extensively on Jewish history in Antiquities of the Jews, and very much information on Herod. And Josephus had a chronology in his head, and in Josephus's chronology, you can work it out on paper, he has Herod dying in what was the equivalent of 4 BC. So, you know, if you ask Joseph, of course, he wasn't using our calendar, but in his head, he has an idea that that's when Herod died. And Josephus wrote this book about 100 years after Herod. So, you know, a little bit of time has elapsed, and Josephus didn't always get all things right in his historical accounts. And there's a problem with his account that Herod died in 4 BC. But nevertheless, that's what Josephus thinks, 4 BC. And so that's where the majority view comes down. The account of the events leading up to Herod's death in Josephus's book includes an eclipse of the moon prior to his death, and an eclipse of the moon on a series of events that immediately lead to his death. There was an eclipse of the moon in 4 BC, and so at least initially some people grabbed onto that and said that's even further confirmation that Herod died in 4 BC. But the problem is that eclipse doesn't allow, it allows not just a 4 BC date, but it allows an exact date within the year. It would have fallen on Purim, a month before Passover. And the narrative that Josephus gives leading up to Herod's death is actually not possible in 4 BC. It starts with a trial and executions on Purim, which is extremely unlikely to have happened. And then a great many things happened between Purim and Passover, which is exactly 1 month later, including the death of Herod, the ascension of his son, and Archelaus, his son, is ruling by the time you get to Passover a month later. But Josephus describes many things that went on between those two things, including travels and things. There's not enough time. And so we're faced with a situation where either Josephus' narrative's wrong or the chronology he has in his head is wrong. They can't both be right. So we can't be dogmatic. I mean, I don't think anybody, we don't know enough to really be sure, but I would lean toward the fact that, toward the inclination that said his narrative is probably right, and the numbers that he's working with in his head, those are probably wrong. There was a more prominent eclipse in 1 BC, more prominent than the one in 4 BC. And between the eclipse and Passover in 1 BC, there was enough time for the things that Josephus describes. When Herod died, almost immediately, just within a few days, his son Archelaus begins to reign. He gets into a sharp dispute with some of the Jews there in Jerusalem who are protesting some of the things that happens, and he kills 3,000 of them and cancels Passover that year. That's like the very first thing that happens when Archelaus begins his reign. And that sheds a little bit of light on this verse that about Joseph, where it says in Matthew 2:22, but when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And he's warned in a dream, and so they end up going back to Nazareth. So there's good reason for being afraid to go there. Archelaus' reign starts out even more bloody than his father Herod. In any count, this is, I think, 1 BC. So the conclusion is that Jesus was born in 2 BC. 29 AD minus 30 years gives 2 BC. Wait, you think it gives 1 BC? Remember, we got to skip the 0. So 29 minus 30 is 2 BC. And 2 BC allows time for Jesus to be born, visit of the wise men, sometime perhaps around Christmas, when Jesus is an infant but not a newborn, as the wise men come sometime later. They have time to flee to Egypt, like the Gospel of Matthew describes, and then they can return a few months later. So anyway, that's my date for the birth of Jesus. And thank you for watching. I hope to be back shortly with another video where we talk about the date of the Passion of Christ, the crucifixion and resurrection.